Welcome students. We are going to discuss the novel Jane Eyre written by Charlotte Bronte today. It was a Victorian novel. To study Victorian novel a little bit, we need to look back on one particular age. Let us look in the late 18th century and early 19th century. If you look at the novels which were written by predecessors like Jane Austen, Walter Scott, they were very different kind of prose style. The Victorian novel already made prose writing into a respectable kind of literature. Earlier, in time of Scott, prose writing, novel writing was really not considered very respectable writing. You had to be respected too if you only wrote poetry, produced drama. But now, in this Victorian period, we find that novel writing has become quite an accepted mode of writing, expressing literature. Moreover, it is the first time when we find novel is taking over the role of a moral guide. Most of these novels portray a character which is an ideal character, and this character goes through a lot of hardships in life to attain some kind of a reward at the end. It's a biblical travel. So you have a reward waiting for you in the end. You work through hardships of life and the reward comes to you. It's a slice of life which is represented to the reader that you should lead your life in this certain manner, and the moral of the novel shows you that this is the best way to live, and you do not worry. There is at the end of your life some kind of reward as it is coming to the protagonist of the novel. Now this was how they wrote most of the novels. I can think of all the authors of Victorian period. I'm sure you know the names of the authors, whether it is a late Victorian like Thomas Hardy, or early Victorian like Charles Dickens, or George Eliot writing, or our Bronte sisters. All of them had more or less this kind of a system in mind. Now why were they doing this? Victorian period also saw a lot of technology coming in, nothing like technology today, but it was a lot of technological change. And because there was industrialization happening, life was going through a change in the Victorian society. People moved from the villages to the towns. These were not the affluent people. They worked in the factories. They lived under very, very shabby circumstances. Many of them lived in unhygienic conditions, fell prey to the fact, in other words, they died because of unhygienic conditions. And therefore, the novel also began to reflect the life that was happening, because art, is never separate from the real life. That is the reason the novel also started showing to the readers that what is the life like. Now, when I talk about governess being a domestic help, I will come to this issue little later, because Jane Eyre itself is a story about a governess. Life of a governess became a very important issue in the Victorian novel. But as I was saying, because the readership was restricted, largely restricted to these people, the novelists also wanted to write something which pleased, catered to their tastes. And you will find it is usually that section of a society, the members of that section which are little underprivileged believe a lot in fatality. That I need to do this because I am predestined to do this. Predestination makes you very fatalistic. They were fatalistic, but to promise them some kind of a reward at the end always brightened up their life. So I think that is the reason why Victorian novels saw this kind of a shift from any other previous novel writing. Now, I just spoke about the governess being the central character. There were innumerable work of fiction being written in the Victorian time which dealt with the first the question of women employment, and secondly the question was that the women who were going to work in other people's house as the governess for their children. Two very tricky issues. One, this was the first time the women were starting out to work. Some women worked in the factories. We are not taking them into consideration because they comprise the lower strata of the society. But there were enough number of middle class women who were going out to teach. But then teaching positions were limited. There were less number of girls' schools, and only in girls' schools could they employ lady teachers. So with the limitation in finding a job as a teacher in a school, many women opted to be teachers to the children who were living in their houses. Obviously, the households which they joined were aristocratic. Otherwise, they would not be able to afford that kind of pay for the governess. Now, the governess's situation was a very peculiar situation. She was an educated woman. She had not only learned how to read and write, but she had learned some other skills. What are the best social etiquettes are. So, she was very adept in using the right fork and the right knife to eat her meals. She also knew how the art of conversation, which has always been very important in the English society. Art of conversation, what to communicate and what also not to communicate when you are feeling tempted to communicate. So, all these arts, which were considered so far only the domain of the aristocratic society, was learnt by the governess as a part of her education to become a governess. Now, when she learns all this, she acquires a peculiar position in life. She herself may be from whatever social background, but she has learned the art of how the upper class lives. She goes and joins an upper class household. What is her status there? She is not a housekeeper. She does not take account of what is happening in the kitchen or what is happening to the other servants. She is only looking after the education of the children of that particular family. So, she should be a little elevated from compared to other domestic staff, but very often her position depended on the benevolence of the employer. If the employer was good natured, she would be allowed to join in the table and eat dinner and lunch with them. If the employer felt that no, she does not belong to my class, she knows certain things, she has certain skills to impart to my children, she would be sent to the nursery to have her meals with the children or by herself. So, it was a very ambiguous kind of a status in her adopted family, or let us say the family she joined as a governess. And mind you, this is not for a year or two, because a governess would possibly join a household when the first child turned, let us say 9, 10, 11, stayed on till the child became school going age at 15. So, we are talking about years, and Victorian families were not families of today, or one child, two children family. So, there would be about 4, 5, 6 average, and each child was coming to the age 9, starting off with the same governess, because nobody would keep one governess for anyone, I mean every child in the family. So, the profession of governess became a heated discussion. There were of course abuses happening against governesses, naturally. In a woman staying in by herself in an alien circumstance with alien people, there could be attempts on her modesty. In fact, we have in this particular story Jane Eyre, when the marriage does not conducted because Rochester is already married. Rochester proposes that Jane Eyre lives with him as his mistress. So, it is another thing that Jane Eyre does not accept it, but if 9 did not accept it, maybe 1 did accept it. So, this became a social concern in the Victorian society about whether it is correct that the women are going to work like this, or whether something can be done, to help them out in their new circumstances in life. It is not easy, because those households which employed the governesses also belong to the upper class of the society. You could not raise a finger at them. Secondly, they were not employed by any kind of union system which existed in the industry. So, how do you regulate? That led to a lot of debate, lot of conversation, lot of writing letters to the editor, and many editorials in various newspapers being devoted to it. So, this was a social background against which Jane Eyre was written by Charlotte Bronte. Now, we are going to look at the real novel, and summarize and try to analyze a little bit of the chapters of the novel. So, first we will look at first 7 chapters, chapters 1 to chapter 7. The story begins with Jane as a small child, and she is a dependent child. She does not have a parent, she is an orphan. She lives with her aunt. So, her maternal aunt is Mrs. Reed. Uncle is also dead. Because the uncle had insisted that his sister's daughter be given a shelter in the house, that Mrs. Reed has kept Jane. She feels no affection at all for Jane, nor does the 3 children that she has, 2 girls and 1 boy. They do not feel a oneness. That is simply because the mother, that is Mrs. Reed, makes it out to her children that Jane is different, Jane is rude, Jane is not able to look adequately happy about the benevolence that she is receiving from her richer relatives, and that keeps Jane apart in her position in the house. And every little fault that this little girl makes, every little mistake that she makes is aggravated, enlarged, given a large dimension, and she is criticized very violently. Now, one such incident lands her up with a punishment. She is locked away in a room which is known as the Red Room. Now, the context of this room is that her uncle, Mr. Reed, maternal uncle, had died in this room. So, in little Jane's mind, this room is associated with death, and once you lock up a little child for the whole night in that room without giving food or anything, she starts seeing visions. She thinks that the dead uncle is already there, and the uncle's ghost has appeared to speak to her, and all sorts of scary things come into her mind. A small child's mind is very imaginative, it's very impressionable mind. And what happens is she falls unconscious. So by the time she is rescued, taken out of the room by the maidservants, she cannot be taken out of the room until Mrs. Reed instructs the rest of the staff. So when she is taken out, she has fallen very, very ill. As a result, a doctor is called in. They were not really doctors as we find them today. Now, these people generally practiced medicine, somewhat natural medicine, some bit they had studied. So we have Mr. Lloyd. He's not Dr. Lloyd, he's Mr. Lloyd because he's not a full-fledged medicine student and doctor. He comes to care for Jane. When he comes, he speaks to Jane and he realizes that Jane is deeply unhappy in Mrs. Reed's house. So the house, which is called Gateshead, even the names that she chooses are very symbolic. So the first home that Jane has is called Gateshead. So gate, heading out to somewhere, beginning of her journey. That's the reason why this novel is also called Journey of a Person through various phases of growth. She grows in age, she also grows through her various experiences she gathers. So her beginning of this journey is at Mrs. Reed's home, which is called Gateshead, and she moves on to the next destination. It's on Mr. Lloyd's suggestion that aunt decides to send her away to
boarding school.
A small girl, 10-year-old, is sent 50 miles away from home without anybody accompanying her. And she goes to a new school, a boarding school for girls, knowing very well that she has said goodbye to this family she has known these few days, whatever few days she has known, and will possibly never see them again. This is exactly where the first half of the first 7 chapters represent. Now, to look into these chapters, we have to say that Jane Austen, while she is doing what is called exposition of characters in these first few chapters, she is also taking Victorian issues of social class, gender issues in hand. She is already dealing with them. The gender issue, that Mrs. Reed's son and Jane gets into trouble. There is a class conflict, there is a gender conflict. He's a boy, he cannot be wrong. He's a boy of a rich woman, he cannot be doubly wrong. There cannot be any chance that she is wrong. Plus, she is not only poor, but she is also dependent on us. So there is class, gender issue right in the beginning. All right. So this is how she begins the novel, and the first 7 chapters will end when she arrives in that new school. The new school's name is also very significant. It's called Lowood. Lowood is a charity school. It is run by one man called Brocklehurst, one of the most corrupt persons that appear in Jane Eyre. If you compare it with Charles Dickens, we take David Copperfield. There are examples of so many such characters. Anyone who ran a charity school was always inclined to this kind of, or Oliver Twist, or Nicholas Nickleby. There is a character like this in all these novels. So they are out to make self gain. There is charitable money available, using the money for my self gain. It is not very different from the scenes we are used to even in our society. So, this is what she comments on. Now, we are going to look at the summary and analysis of chapters 8 to 15. These chapters are devoted to Jane's experiences in Lowood school. Jane has been already targeted by Mr. Brocklehurst. Why? Because Mr. Brocklehurst was the person who was in connection or in communication with Mrs. Reed, and Mrs. Reed had warned him that she is of deceitful nature. She lies, she tries to throw tantrums. Teachers must take a guard against her. And some teachers actually react to this piece of information with lot of disgust for this girl. And in Lowood, quickly she makes one friend. Her name is Helen Burns. Helen Burns is a very important character because Helen Burns later on signifies a kind of religiosity in this novel. As I told you that there is a moral concern in all Victorian novels. So, Christianity was also a concern in Jane Eyre. That Christianity is about always sacrificing, always forgiving. And when Helen expresses these kinds of feelings, that she is constantly targeted by the teachers of the school, she is constantly pulled up for doing small mistakes. She says, I do not want to protest because this is what God wants me to suffer through. And I know I will not live for long, and I know there is a paradise waiting for me. This is a view of Christianity which Jane does not agree. Jane believes in self-respect. Jane believes that she needs to be given her due. She cannot be criticized for things that she has not done. Unfortunately, we see that Helen Burns dies. And she dies of consumption. That means a very common disease those days. Most people died of tuberculosis. And that is when the society's attention came to this particular charitable school. And they took note that living conditions were not good. Mr. Brocklehurst was thrown out. And that is when the conditions start improving. So, in her time in Lowood first as a student, she sees this change. Jane continues 6 years as a student, and then 2 years she joins as a teacher in that place. So, Lowood time is again getting over, and once Lowood time gets over, she is ready to move into another phase of her life. What is interesting here to note, apart from the commentary on Christianity, that Jane Eyre is almost like a novel in 5 acts. So, you have the first act in Gateshead, and every time she geographically changes her position, her life moves in a different kind of a realm. So, the first life was Gateshead. As I said, it's like throwing her into a new world. Lowood is where she had moved through. From a low she had gone. Now she is going to enter yet another, because once after serving for 2 years as a teacher, Jane decides that she does not want to be a teacher anymore. She wants to apply for another kind of position, and there a supernatural element comes in her life. She hears a voice, a clairvoyant voice, which tells her to make an advertisement in the newspaper looking for a job, and she does that, and Mrs. Fairfax answers that advertisement saying that she has a girl called Adelaide, and Adelaide requires a governess. So, can Jane come over and stay in their house, which is called Thornfield, and look after this girl? Again, Thornfield, field of thorns, also not very easy life for Jane. Jane will have to go through all these phases to emerge the person that she is going to finally bloom into. So, the entire process of living through the novel is like her development of her personality. She is going to grow into a very matured, complete human being, but before that she has to live through the Lowood, the Thornfield, only then she can go there. Alright. So, this is where we will wrap up this lesson. But I must remind you that 2 things I am missing out here. One is Mr. Rochester. Who is Mr. Rochester? Mr. Rochester is actually the owner of the Thornfield house. Jane does not meet him in the beginning. She only is expected to interact with Mrs. Fairfax, who is nothing but the housekeeper after reaching there. Again, showing you the class. Now, the class to which Jane belongs is the class of staff. So, she need not at all get to interact with the master in the first place. She can interact with the housekeeper and look after the child, who is her responsibility. When she meets Rochester, as we know from our reading of this novel, that Rochester and Jane Eyre has a future together. But at the point of meeting, Jane does not find Rochester particularly attractive. She thinks he's an opinionated man, obviously, because he's the master. So he must have expressed certain opinions which Jane found that may not be very pleasant character. But over very short period of time, Jane as well as Rochester both develop a different kind of feeling for one another, propose to her, accept her as a life partner. Next, we are going to analyze chapter 16 to chapter 23. These chapters, again continuing in Thornfield, Jane has already discovered that she feels attracted by Rochester. Rochester definitely has an attraction. Jane feels that the obstacle in her way is Miss Ingram and her mother. They call her incubi. Incubi means dependent. So, dependent, somebody who is unwanted. Once again, that same stamp is coming on her. Even as a governess, she is dependent on this family. She lives under their roof. She is again spoken to very disrespectfully by Mrs. Ingram and Miss Ingram. And this Miss Ingram is supposed to be the lady with whom Mr. Rochester is going to get married to. So, this is her first obstacle. But then this is not the only obstacle that there is, and we will only understand a little later that there is a bigger obstacle. Mr. Rochester is already a married man. He has been married to a woman and she is gone mad and she is locked up in the attic rooms. So, she is also imprisoned. Now, critics, again commenting on it, says that it shows women's imprisonment. Just as the imprisonment of Jane in Red Room is an imprisonment of a woman in a circumstance in life which continues for a long time. This woman, Bertha Mason, who is married to Rochester, is also permanently imprisoned and in a mad fit, and she starts trying to put a house on fire by pulling candles here and there. But no one comes to know about Bertha Mason, at least Jane is not aware of her. It takes a longer time. Mr. Rochester will propose to her, and when after she accepts Mr. Rochester and the marriage is going to be almost finalized, that all these things come out. But for the time being, it is important to note that she finds the house has been set to fire, and at least Rochester's room has been set to fire. And a visitor, Mr. Mason, who comes to visit suddenly that house, is bitten by someone and is profusely bleeding. She finds very unusual things happening, but these things are not given any explanation. But later on in the hindsight, she realizes that Mr. Mason was bitten by Bertha Mason. And Mr. Mason, Bertha Mason, you obviously realize they are related, they are brother and sister. Mr. Mason had come to meet his sister. But even he does not convey to Jane that there is a woman who is imprisoned in the attic and who is married to Mr. Rochester. Now, in the meantime, Mrs. Reed in Gateshead is at deathbed. Jane is kind. Jane takes leave of 7 days and go. On her return from Thornfield, something very, very interesting happens, which is the subject of the next couple of chapters. So, when we analyze that part of the chapters, we will talk about that. So, is there something you would like to ask? Did you ever feel that there is something which is eluding you even now, or? Okay, then thank you very much for being here.